And we'll be kicking off with Martin Zeilinger, who is a new media researcher, practitioner and curator, who's interested in emerging technologies in relation to cultural ownership, authorship and creativity. His bio is in the program. Martin will be speaking today about All Your Photo Are Belong to Us, Post-Scarcity Photography in the Blockchain. Some of the themes that Martin's talking about, he's recently written about for the Photographers Gallery on the online platform Unthinking Photography, so please check that out if you're interested in learning more. So Martin, would you like to take the stage?
Okay, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be part of this, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm in a really good spot to see when they bring in the coffee, and I could let you know. But I'm also not going to go over time, and so I won't keep you. Move this a bit closer, yeah. All right, so I want to begin by saying that I share Nina's hesitations about the concept of post-capitalism. It's a big can of worms and a difficult kind of set of concepts packed all into one. It's of course a speculative, utopian concept, maybe something that we're working towards in some ways. And so what I want to focus on in my talk is a specific facet of what might one day characterize a post-capitalist society, namely the concept of post-scarcity. In other words, the idea of a situation in which scarcity or lack are replaced by abundance. The ungrammatical phrase in my title is, of course, a reference to a very popular internet meme that many of you will be familiar with. In my title, it refers to rather unfortunate and very problematic attempt by Kodak to introduce a technology that would essentially control and commodify the online ecosystem of free-floating images. In certain regards, we can say that we already live in post-scarcity times. For example, at least in our immediate context, connectivity through networked communication technologies has become quite ubiquitous, and we have access to what feels like endless amounts of cloud-based storage capabilities. And one of the consequences of this is an immense proliferation of photographs circulating online. It's impossible really to get even a remotely authoritative figure on this, but some good estimates that I've come across suggest that maybe as many as 1.8 billion photos were uploaded every day in 2014, and something like 1.2 trillion digital photos were taken last year in 2017, most of which would also end up online in one way or another. So we could definitely say that with regard to image proliferation, we certainly do live in a post-scarcity time. And for all those who are taking photos, whether it's for fun or as artists or professionally, this might raise some difficult questions regarding the afterlife of these pictures. What becomes of digital photographs once they circulate online? What rights should be attached to them, and how could the creators of the images and the holders of these rights be protected? How should the constant churn of online photographs be controlled, and how might that even work? Is that even desirable? I'll focus on one approach to answer these questions, and one that is being spearheaded by the Eastman Kodak company. And it involves around a custom-made cryptocurrency and blockchain technology attached to that. What I'll suggest is that Kodak proposes a technology that would effectively render digital photographs artificially scarce, even if they exist in countless digital copies. How might that work, and why would anyone want to do that? Let me take the second question first, because it's actually really an easy one to answer. Kodak considers all photographs as commodities that should have private owners and that should have a clearly definable value. It's generally assumed that the value of any property item is, of course, directly linked to its scarcity somehow. So to give you an example, if I'm a professional photographer and copies of my photos are floating around freely everywhere online, that this might negatively impact the monetary value of each of these photographs. In other words, Kodak embodies a very typical pro-capitalist perspective and is trying to invent a technology that makes it possible to capture the value contained in digital images that are currently often, we currently often experience them as kind of free-floating and wildly proliferating. I want to use most of my talk to address the first question. How might that work? And connected to that, I want to offer a critique of Kodak's proposed technology and formulate some critical ideas in favor of a post-scarcity world of digital images that can move kind of without restriction. In early 2018, the Eastman Kodak company introduced Kodak One, which is a blockchain-based platform, and Kodak Coin, a bespoke cryptocurrency that's connected to this platform. Together, these two are supposed to tame the crazy vortex of digital images circulating online by providing new and improved digital rights management tools. Using the technology, it would be possible to trace any digital photograph online, to monitor how it circulates, and then subsequently to trade it as a potentially valuable digital asset. This might sound cutting edge and futuristic, and in some ways it is, but Kodak is actually really not alone in developing these kinds of technology. There's a growing number of startup ventures that are attempting something very similar, including, for example, a platform operated by the Chinese internet mega giant Baidu with the ominous name Totem. What all of these platforms share is that they try to develop a combination of image authentication, digital rights management, digital art marketplaces, and bundle all of that in proprietary blockchain applications. In essence, Kodak One would consist of an autonomously operating web monitoring system designed to find all instantiations of an individual image that exists online, and to record these findings on a decentralized, presumably incorruptible blockchain database. Theoretically, that might allow Kodak to trace the movement of any digital photograph across websites, social media, databases, what have you. And the information collected would form a permanent record regarding the provenance of the image in question. Presumably that could then aid in establishing its value. The creators of the individual images would then be able to protect and enforce their intellectual property interests and would receive royalties in the form of Kodak Coin cryptocurrency tokens. After Kodak announced this innovation in early 2018, the shares of the company briefly gained 300% in value, and it looked like Kodak might be returning to its old glory days. But as it is, Kodak One, like so many other overhyped commercial blockchain applications, is actually floundering and doesn't really exist and hasn't even really taken off so far. As of today, the platform only exists conceptually as press releases, a white paper, corporate websites that offer very, very bland and opaque information. Meanwhile, Kodak One continues to draw quite heavy criticism, and I think it raises some really important questions. Is it necessary for a project such as this to be designed as a blockchain application? I'll return to this. What will photographers do with Kodak Coin cryptocurrency tokens? And most importantly, what is at stake for photographers when control of their work is decentralized and moved onto the blockchain? The underlying assumption here is that the work of digital photographers is poorly protected and often misappropriated for commercial purposes without permission. And many of us might be inclined to agree with that observation. But there's also a number of critical issues connected to this assumption. And overall, I think Kodak One is a really good template for projects deserving of a closer look and broader criticism of these kinds of blockchain-related art projects. there's at least 3 important points to raise in this context. The first is that it's unclear why Kodak 1 would actually need to be run as a blockchain application. I won't go into detail on this now, but I'm very happy to elaborate in the Q&A. This is actually the first time I'm giving a talk like this without attempting a 3-minute explanation of what the blockchain is, but we can do that after. Anyways, the core functions of the platform could easily be carried out by other means. It's not necessary really for it to be on the blockchain. I suspect that the key function of invoking the blockchain here is to invoke the many positive associations that are often connected to the concept of decentralization, which is kind of this catchphrase used to emphasize attempts of radically disrupting and democratizing digital networks. Presumably, a truly decentralized platform would remove control over creative expressions from corporations and so forth, from any centralized power, and might shift this control back to the creators themselves. And that, of course, might be something that's desirable. But this is really not the case here in this example, since Kodak 1 aims to kind of create a new black-boxed market standard for commercial image authentication and digital rights management. So what Kodak is really aiming at is rather a kind of centralization by means of decentralization technology. The second important criticism, I think, would be that it is so far unclear how Kodak coins, this dedicated cryptocurrency with which photographers are supposed to be rewarded, how that will work. From all the information that is available right now, it seems that it might actually be impossible to convert these tokens into actual money, meaning that photographers would be rewarded in a proprietary currency that they can only use on Kodak-owned marketplaces to buy equipment and that sort of thing. So Kodak is hoping to create a closed system, a closed ecosystem that effectively locks photographers into a very specific dynamic of how they work, how they get rewarded, how they get compensated, and so forth. Certainly that contradicts the idea that Kodak 1 would really democratize anything, the management of digital photographs. The third point would be maybe the most important one in the context of a broader discussion of post-capitalist photography. Kodak is operating on the assumption that every digital image that exists online represents first and foremost a valuable asset that we must protect and monetize and commercially exploit. And I wonder if that's really true in our post-scarcity moment of digital image proliferation, and if that really is also desirable. Far from democratizing or decentralizing the world of digital photography, Kodak invokes a philosophy of financialization, in which every single photograph becomes an ownable, tradable artifact. That will only further monetize and tokenize cultural practice. Apart from important privacy concerns and the corporate control that Kodak would effectively have over images monitored with this technology, I think Kodak 1 also opens up avenues for more general critical debate regarding the value of post-scarcity image economies. You might have been wondering about the photographs that form the backdrop of my slides. All of them are taken from an ongoing project called Internet Vernacular by a Montreal-based artist named Clint Enns, whose artistic practice in photography often relates to found images, found image-taking devices, and also photographs appropriated online. And there's, of course, a long-established tradition of vernacular photography in recording and documenting everyday life, often without any artistic pretension and without any authorship claims attached to the images. And there's a very interesting theoretical discourse linking vernacular photography to outsider art, to the kind of informal mapping of cultural and socio-political histories, also maybe emerging questions around curation. But it will also be interesting to consider how the vernacular could persist within the confines of technologies such as those proposed by Kodak. We might find that the vernacular as such, in how it negates authorship claims or problematizes the concept of image ownership, is maybe a mode of expression through photography that resonates very well with the concept of post-scarcity, and maybe similarly also a mode of existence for photographs that is fundamentally incompatible with the hyper-capitalist kind of image dystopias of artificially scarce digital photography, such as it is proposed by Kodak One. In this sense, Kodak One is a reminder that what we currently have is a very messy global network of more or less free-floating, kind of uncontrollable digital image content that forms a very unique internet vernacular that we don't really have a very good means to even grasp fully. This untamed wilderness resonates well, I think, with what Hito Steyerl has called poor images. Images that are ripped, reproduced, itinerant, transient, shared, or resistant, and that often lose resolution and context in their circulation online. In other words, images that are difficult to control, images that lend themselves to a multitude of variable, permutable signification, and which are resisting for now the kinds of propertization that would come with projects like Kodak One. To conclude, some media theory argues that the digital itself, the digital as such, is a context that favors the concept of post-scarcity. This is really well reflected in the naturally decentralized, anarchic profusion of digital images that we can find online. Images that exist in a mode which ideally is really and truly beyond scarcity and beyond the capitalist concept of ownership. However, projects such as Kodak One are also a good reminder that we live in a hyper-capitalist economy in which the utopian post-scarcity potential of the online digital image could at any moment revert back to simply a new type of maybe decentralized but very much centrally controlled digital commodity. Kodak One wants to catalog images, meta tag them, authenticate them, and kind of surreptitiously track them in what and kind of turn what Hito Steyerl called poor images in what Kodak might want to think of as valuable property, as rich images. If that's supposed to turn photographs into such an asset, then we really have to ask who indeed will be enriched by such a move and how. As far as I'm aware, in the history of intellectual property rights enforcement, there never really has been a moment when centralized control or the very strict enforcement of creators' rights and licensing issues have really truly benefited creators, or the artists involved, but more likely the corporate rights holders acting on their behalf. So any desire or any radical creative spirit to change the scenario, I think is very, very unlikely to emerge from Kodak One or similar blockchain-based photography platforms. As I've tried to suggest, the idea of a richness of digital photography could maybe point us towards post-capitalist scenarios of artistic expression and cultural exchange that embrace and celebrate the idea of the post-scarce rather than shutting it down. You won't find any indication of this when you research Kodak One online. All you'll find is incredibly bland and alienating stock photography that I really didn't want to include in my slides here. For now, I think the kind of cultural, social, and critical richness that goes beyond commodification and beyond ownership models already exists maybe in this kind of free-floating vernacular photography of the type that is collected by artists such as Clint Enns. And I'll end with that, and here's one more image. Thank you.
I should have mentioned we're going to have 3 presentations and then questions at the end. And am I right in saying coffee has arrived? Okay, you're welcome to refuel on coffee. Next up, we've got Ben Burbridge returns to the floor with his presentation, Photography Institutions After Capitalism, ?
Thank you. So this is Photography Museum as imagined by iStock. It's kind of background noise to an extent. In his ongoing project, Scratching at Things Like a Disavowal, Walid Raad performs a kind of paranoid examination of speculation in the art world, artist pension plans, algorithmic prediction of market trends based on the surveillance of online search activity, the person tasked with designing the alternative art scene in the UEA. And while grounded in fact, much of what is described seems so far-fetched that it must be fiction, and thus the performance provides a very productive form of denaturalization. Part of the performance is accompanied by what curator Eva Respini calls digitally manipulated photographs of actual museum doorways, the rooms and hallways endlessly looping and superimposing, with galleries empty of both visitors and art. Rard explained that when thinking politically, my term was never institutional critique. My term was ideology and hegemony. Ideology in the sense of how do ideas become ruling ideas. So the partial corporate takeover of the UK's photography institutions, public photography institutions, has operated in two directions simultaneously. Both have longer histories with their seeds in the Thatcher and the Blair years, but both have intensified, often quite dramatically, in a so-called austerity era. While publicly funded institutions, and I'm talking mainly about museums with photography collections, but I think we could include galleries like this one, are increasingly required to behave like businesses. The steady withdrawal of state funding makes them increasingly reliant on the types of private finance sometimes available via corporate sources. So the process is close to, but not quite the same as the shock politics of disaster capitalism described by Naomi Klein, insofar as the financial crisis of 2008 has been exploited. That kind of disorientation has been exploited as a way of withdrawing state funds. Are they not perhaps to kind of totally privatise collective assets? And I think that's important. So I'm going to run through some specific examples. This is kind of what we don't talk about when we talk about photography. So in 2011, the Arts Council responded to central cuts of 30% by withdrawing funding altogether to some organisations. So when Side Gallery in Newcastle and Pavilion in Leeds, for example, when that happened there, it made visible what Saskia Sassen calls the systemic edge of a political economy based on expulsion. So Sassen's argument is that the brutality of a neoliberal system, a kind of clear sense of who this actually services, because it's not us, becomes clearest when people are actually kind of forced out of the socio and economic order. And I think the same is true if you think about the number of curators who have lost their jobs as a consequence of various restructurings in the past 10 years. It's another happy paper. Right? The Arts Council creation of national portfolio organisations, which was another response to that cut, which is a smaller elite group who receive regular funding, has emphasised the importance of scale over smaller efforts at community engagement. It's also promoted a culture of takeovers and mergers, so that happened with Brighton Photobiennial and PhotoWorks. MPOs are required to reapply for funding every 4 years, thus even this elite group exists in a condition that is, if not precarious, certainly not secure. And the MPO application process is highly competitive, compelling organisations to often kind of promise that they'll deliver more for less. That's normally a matter of fewer staff doing more work, and I think if people are honest, we can feel that in the quality of the work people do. I mean, parts of what I'm talking about here are based on a kind of close reading of funding documents, which I find weirdly interesting. The primary case for funding is often made in terms of contributions to the economy, in terms of attracting cultural tourism and powering regeneration, rather than the intrinsic value of critically and creatively engaging with photographic culture. Indeed, the value of engagement itself is often expressed in instrumental terms linked to larger economic imperatives. So this was true of the Blairite funding regime, right? But I think we're seeing quite an interesting shift of late, and that was clear with what happened in Bradford with the National Media Museum, which has been refashioned the National Science and Media Museum, and there's a kind of which meant they gave all their art photography to the V&A, right? And this was all based in a sense. Joe Quinton-Tullett, the director, spoke about inspiring the people of Bradford, and you're like, well, what are you going to inspire them to do? And the sense is that they're all going to start tech startups, right? That's the kind of the feeling there. And so I think there's an interesting shift from kind of Blairite fantasies of a creative Britain to kind of Silicon Valley fantasies of tech startups. And that has important implications for photography, right? That kind of speaks to art and technology simultaneously, or at different times in different ways. MPOs are contractually obliged to proactively diversify their income streams. Sponsorship, ticket sales, merchandise, cafes, private foundations all play prominent roles in the business plans that they're required to submit. This means their role is no longer just to generate economic activity. That's the Blairite model, right? That you fund them and then they regenerate / gentrify and attract cultural tourism. It's not enough to do that. Actually, you now have to fund that activity yourself as well by making private income. This has inevitable and tangible impact on staffing and programmes. Footfall and the generation of immediate spectacle become key goals. The Arts Council is clear that this is not about expanding overall capacity, but permanently shifting organisations' income base. So there's an extent to which public funding is now paying the salaries of people entrusted with privatising our public organisations. Performance must be measurable and regularly measured. Time and expertise, as Katrina's already said, you'll see certain, you'll know which people work in galleries when I say KPIs and you see them bristle. Key performance indicators, so this is, so a lot of time and effort is spent dreaming these up and then measuring how effectively they've been achieved. So we're reminded here of Mark Fisher's take on the audit culture that grew up across the public sector during the past 30 years. Which kind of flew in the face of ideas that neoliberalism was going to put an end to bureaucratic meddling, right? And he says this is down to, he said that this was down to the inherent resistance of certain processes and services to marketisation. So what late capitalism shares with Stalinism is this valuing of symbols of achievement over achievement itself. So the work attached to all of these KPIs is very close to what David Grieber calls the bullshit jobs that have proliferated across the public and private sector in recent years. So these are tasks that we secretly believe, or not so secretly believe, that they don't really need to be performed, which he calls a scar across our collective psyche. MPOs must also demonstrate that they've got mechanisms for self-evaluation in place. So this is a common tactic that passes down responsibility and expense of surveillance down to the level of institutions and very often individuals. And so we see the same sort of thing happen in universities and places where the Home Office's hostile environment, that it's often low-paid administrators now tasked with it working out if people are entitled to work here. The consequences of self-surveillance are similar to those described by Ivor Southwood in relation to the experience of job seekers with their weekly appointments to prove they really are looking for work, even when it's which kind of privatises the idea of employment, privatises responsibility for what is potentially a social problem. He says the ideological apparatuses of the job centre routinely interpolate the claimant as lazy or willfully inadequate, if not downright fraudulent. And under such pressure, even the most conscientious or self-assured person would struggle not to internalise this image. So really what we're talking about here are the forms of subjectivity cultivated within particular structures and systems, the way that surveillance breeds a sense of untrustworthiness or paranoia. Precarity closes down temporal horizons and promotes short-term calculation. And measurement leads us to think and act in terms that can be measured. So on this I want to make 3 points. One, I think those who wag angry fingers at individual staff or even organisations based on some misplaced sense of their own ethical purity could do well to think more in terms of systems and structures. I wonder how a Labour government would approach the question of measurement and auditing in the public sector. So it's one thing to fund it better, but I think we need to ask, well, but on what terms? I also wonder how we unionise or mobilise against bullshit working. I really like the idea of a public sector audit boycott, where it's kind of a unique form of industrial action where actually you become more productive as a consequence of withdrawing a particular kind of labour. If teachers said no to Ofsted and the NHS refused to do the thing, they have to show they're spending the right amount of money on drugs. We said no to the TEF and the REF and so on. So the slow and steady withdrawal of public funds, coupled with the legal obligation to diversify income streams, has led to increasing reliance on private sources. So I want to focus briefly on 2 of these. Firstly, corporate sponsorship, so the Deutsche Börse Group here, Virgin Media at Mediaspace, the now defunct Mediaspace, Hyundai Card at Tate, and the Pictet Group with their prize that tours all over the place. And then secondly, the private foundations with close links to multinationals. So for example, Tate's photography initiatives are funded sometimes via the Luma Foundation, which is Mia Hoffman's foundation, which is funded through her inherited shareholders in the family pharmaceutical empire. So where the laundering of corporate reputations through sponsorship is likened by Julian Stalabras to the tobacco executive with a Picasso over his mantelpiece to show visitors to his house that he's human, foundations like Luma embody what Zizek calls the liberal communism of people like Soros and Gates, widely celebrated for philanthropic efforts in ways that kind of counteract or even justify their brutal business activities. Something interesting about kind of socially responsible and socially irresponsible behaviours here. Of course, there are other sources of funding, public universities, for example, which is the case today. But universities face remarkably similar challenges, so this event will create visibility for branded organisations, Sussex and South Bank, potentially help draw in fee-paying students, create measurable satisfaction among our existing students, welcome existing students, remember this when it comes to the NSS, and produce measurable impact, wait for the questionnaire at the end, and I'm not joking, this has transformed the way you think about everything, which will trade in for more money at the next audit. So what's the place of photography in all of this? My examples are all photographic, but the larger structures and conditions they represent are typical of the arts more broadly. And so I wonder if there's a kind of perverse form of medium specificity that could come into view if we got a better handle on why corporations wanted to fund photography specifically. And looking across their published statements, it seems there was some value it as art, some as part of a wider media culture, others it's a politically powerful mode of communication. And when you view all of these together, actually what it confirms is kind of John Tagg's idea that we think about photographies rather than photography. I really thought I was going to nail the idea of medium specificity based on what the corporations are into, but it didn't work. And I wonder if we could do the same thing with funding, public funding applications. So what is it we suggest can be measured? What do KPIs suggest about photography? So what do we do in response? Well, we could follow the lead of someone like Andrea Fraser and refuse the disavowals that often characterise the social rituals promoted by institutions. So we would insist that the funding of photography be central, not just to what it means, artistically, not just socially. So this would mean visitors to the Deutsche Börse Prize think about the £12.5 million in fines paid to resolve an investigation by German authorities into possible insider trading. Tate's purchase of Martin Parr's book collection would speak of price-fixing conspiracies and the decision to charge £90,000 per patient for access to a drug capable of extending the lives of women with breast cancer, while also boasting annual core operating profits of more than $17 billion and a margin in excess of 20%. That's Luma. Those contemplating submissions to the Pictet Prize would contemplate the commercial facilitation of tax evasion, and visitors to Revelation's experiments in photography, I curated it at Media Space, would explore a complex network of offshore subsidiaries and buying up parts of the NHS. Which I didn't think about, I should have thought about it. So London Holton's archive represents an unusual and particularly telling case study in the context of this discussion. What was originally called the Holton Press Library grew out of Picture Post and was later bought by the BBC, then by a cable TV magnate before it was bought by Getty Images in 1996. And it was one of a number of aggressive acquisitions that Getty made as it looked to build its dominance in the editorial and stock image marketplace. Its success in that exercise, in building that dominance, was key to its efforts to disrupt /democratise /deprofessionalise stock image production, which was very much in line with the low-paid casual labour of platform capitalism and the gig economy. It's also helped Getty secure deals to license photographs from our public museums. So there are ways now that the Science Museum collection is being marketised, and that money is going to Getty shareholders and to the Science Museum. So what's interesting is that Getty is a business that ended up with, but is not identified as being, a photography collection. And it houses an immense number of prints and employs a full-time curator. It's also a collection capable of, quote, paying for itself, both because the organisation that owns it was established with the sole principle of profitability, and because it does not have to cover all those additional costs involved in serving the public, so exhibitions, education, access, and evaluation and auditing. So what it makes clear, I think, is where that neoliberal fantasy ends up, where you get a profitable institution, but the public are nowhere to be seen. Loads and loads of photographs that are kind of sold and so on, but no members of the public. But also you get a clear sense of why that the kind of public institution is always going to lose in that context. But I think we can learn something else from Getty. And this is, I'm beginning to wrap it up now. As a functioning picture library, it's a site of constant reproduction. Objects are preserved in order to be copied, shared, circulated, printed elsewhere in ways that can, at some level, it feels a bit like Walter Benjamin and the assault. The photography represented this assault on the cult of unique objects. At the same time, there's something quite compelling about experiencing the effects of a collection that interacts with, even collides with, a partially democratic approach to servicing the stock image market. So where an image search creates these weird juxtapositions between the canonical and the stock, the old and the new, the deliberately collected and the recently submitted. And so I guess part of what, I haven't fully worked this thing out, but I like Jodie Dean's idea of selfie communism, which is her effort to rework the idea that capitalism would produce its own gravediggers. So it's the idea that all of these selfies uploaded onto social media platforms in the end, rather than reinforce an idea of the individual, they actually create a kind of collective subjectivity in some strange way. This move from here I am to here we are. So, there's two more things to say. So I wonder if the activity of Getty selling photographs also suggests some kind of alternative relationship to a photography institution, based on principles of circulation, reproduction and reuse on the one hand, and horizontal participatory cultures on the other. Which is not to say all these photos are the same, right? I think within these parameters, speaking to kind of Nina's point, this wouldn't necessarily be about flattening. All of this seems very close to Andrew Dewdney's point. He's not here, I was going to look. Andrew, he's on his way. Where he suggested that cultural institutions of modernism, galleries, museums, universities, must seriously plug into the network and its users. This was a great opportunity to collaborate and co-create with network users and groups in order to not only make the network of power visible, but to create new publics based upon equality of knowledge, access and experience. I like that idea. I think there's something quite interesting in that idea. I can also see risks, and that's those risks will be my conclusion. So I worry, for example, about calling on a public already drowning in bullshit work living precarious lives to then take on the role of co-creators as yet more unpaid work. At the same time that curators either get paid or get laid off because we've outsourced their work to volunteers. So it's a kind of utopian sentiment that could very quickly slip into something a bit big society. I also wonder about who's going to clean the toilets in this institution, whether they're going to be co-creators too. So to avoid all of this, we must ensure that at no stage we let the question of redistribution slip out of sight. This is not just a matter of the redistribution required to fund photography institutions. Where does it come from? Which institutions receive it and on what terms? It would also be about the money required to fund the material subsistence of those co-creators, which I guess, this is where something like a universal basic income could potentially come into the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Next up, we have Emily Rosamond of Goldsmiths with the investment image of contemporary art. And Emily is an artist and writer and lecturer in visual cultures and joint program leader at BA Fine Art and History of Art at Goldsmiths, and her recent writings have appeared in the Journal of Aesthetics and Culture, Paragrana, and Finance and Society, amongst others.
Hello. So first of all, I'd like to really thank all of the organizers of today's event for inviting me. It's been a really interesting morning so far. And I'd also like to open with a bit of a caveat, which is that I am not a photography scholar per se. This is a fact that might become painfully obvious to some of you shortly. But I hope to try to offer an image of what I think photography is doing that I at once feared was too broad and grandiose, and at the same time, kind of too banal of a way of speaking for an event such as this. And yet I'm still operating on the faith that the drive to produce a very broad-ranging image of the relationship between photography and the cultural and neoliberal logics of investment might help us to do something. And I'll also say that I deeply share some of the reservations about the term post-capitalism that Nina and Martin already mentioned. And so this will be very much a talk that is descriptive and diagnostic in its character. But again, hoping that by producing certain kinds of description, this might give us a kind of purchase on the contemporary image, an understanding of how it works that might then open up ways to potentially imagine interventions. And so I'd like to basically outline a few very preliminary points toward an investment image of contemporary art. This is an image of contemporary art that kind of departs from the language of liking, commenting, and sharing. And this is something that, of course, many others have tried to do. I want to think about photography's normative performativities. In other words, the ways in which, if as J.L. Austin in 1955 described that there are certain kinds of performative speech acts, instances in which to say something is to do something, then what do we make of the ways in which commenting on photographs online, in the form of actual comments or in the form of pressing the like or share button, indeed the act of uploading itself, what ways do these sort of, these instances of saying something, if you like, what do they actually do? I'd like to suggest that these acts of liking and sharing, of circulating likenesses and also likes, likability, affinity, and platitude, that these things instantiate an investment image of contemporary art, that they invite us to think about contemporary photography as part of a gestural circulation of accumulating values, of investments in images. So when we click like, we're sort of investing in an image in a way. And I'd like to draw a sketch about what this kind of, this way of thinking of the online photographic image might open up by means of action. And to do so, I want to draw on some ways of thinking about kinesthetic photography online, also on some ideas about investment and neoliberal era economy. And then finally, I'll talk through a few images that I think have a quite interesting relation, that sort of instantiate an interesting relationship between this kind of normative performativity of likes and clicks, and that invite us to rethink those as images of investment. And one of the key claims that I'd like to put forward to you today and to open up for discussion is that one of the ways in which online images seem to function as instantiations of investment is to produce images and instantiations of volatility itself. Volatility, in other words, as a foundational financial logic. Volatility as the range of possible values which a particular product of investment might have at any point in the future. As Randy Martin and many other scholars of financial capitalism have remarked, the uncertainty of future value is far from a problem for investors, right? Indeed, it is the very foundation of their claim to value. In other words, investors, those who invent, circulate, and purchase derivative swaps and other complex financial products, investors are the ones who can actually map out an image of volatility, sort of work based on an idea of the potential flux and flow of values in the future, and actually figure out ways to come out on top no matter what, to profit no matter what ends up happening, to kind of parse out the future and make the future inevitably profitable through the use of financial products. And so I'd like to suggest that by thinking about the image as actively an investment, we might also be able to think about the ways in which images are inexorably intertwined with the production and understanding of the role and the importance of volatility in our contemporary moment, in our contemporary capitalist moment. So I'd like to start by grounding this discussion with a few theories of the online image that really try to draw attention away from images' iconicity and rather to draw attention toward the image's circulation, its means of moving, its speed, its velocities, if you like. And some of these might be quite familiar to many of you here. The first, of course, Martin already mentioned in his talk, is Hito Starrell's In Defense of the Poor Image from 2009. Starrell writes, quote, "Perhaps one has to redefine the value of the image, or more precisely, to create a new perspective for it. Apart from resolution and exchange value, one might imagine another form of value defined by velocity, intensity, and spread. Poor images are poor because they are heavily compressed and travel quickly. They lose matter and gain speed. But they also express a condition of dematerialization, shared not only with the legacy of conceptual art, but above all with the contemporary modes of semiotic production." And so Starrell here is thinking of a way to reimagine the value of what she refers to as the poor image. In other words, the poor copy, the pirated film, filmed on a camera from within the movie theater, for example. And thinking about how these gain a certain kind of value even as they lose production value. They gain circulation, they gain speed, right? This gives us a sense of, I think, what's at stake in formulating an investment theory of the contemporary image. And another one which some of you may know is Paul Frosch's quite interesting work on what he calls the gestural image. And this is from an essay that he wrote called The Gestural Image, the Selfie Photography Theory, and Kinesthetic Sociability. Interestingly, Frosch begins this essay by saying that many have already tried to favor circulation, metadata, non-visual aspects of the online photographic image. And not surprisingly, since these might be the kinds of qualities, the properties of online images that are newest to us. But he kind of, he wants to return to photographic theory in his work, thinking about photographic theories of indexicality. And interestingly, where he ends up is at the idea of the selfie as a gestural image. So he writes, the selfie is a gestural image, and we should not understand its aesthetics purely in visual terms. Rather, selfies conspicuously integrate still images into a technocultural circuit of corporeal social energy that I will call kinesthetic sociability. So there's a really complex interplay between some kind of investment in iconicity that online images still have, and yet this iconicity always takes us outside of the frame. It takes us into the broader spheres of circulation, of which online photography is, of course, always a part. And so this is one sort of basis that we might sort of draw from to construct an investment image of contemporary art. And another might be something like Michel Ferre's version of neoliberal capitalism, and the particular kinds of attention that he draws to what he refers to as the investee. One of Ferre's central claims is that in an era of neoliberal capitalism, in which we are all both investors and investees, this necessitates a rethinking of activism. Away from, for example, liberal era models of activism that favored the role of the employee, for example, so union activism, for example, and rather that we need to kind of rethink activism according to our role as investees, as those who are invested in. And Ferre draws attention to the importance of ranking and rating as part of this what he terms rated agency, and he thinks that it's very important to think about intervening in how things are ranked and rated, that this is actually an active site for some form of resistance to occur. And while Fair is largely talking about things such as the Escrache in Spain, the sort of ongoing housing strikes where protesters were sort of following MPs around to get them to vote in favor of better rights for homeowners. I think that we can apply some of Fair's ways of thinking to an analysis of the always circulating online image. So of course there are many artworks that we could think of that might fall into some of these categories, that might ask us to think about circulation as sort of overtaking the iconicity of the image. One that comes to mind for me is, of course, Petra Kortright, who enables us to think about the ways in which the quantitative aspects of investment, right, accumulating numbers of comments and likes, kind of takes over the qualities of the image. And so in this early work, webcam from 2007, Kortright sort of appropriates keyword lists from spam email accounts to kind of up and then sort of doesn't give us the expectations that the keywords would suggest in order to kind of hijack YouTube's like searchability criteria and get a ton, loads and loads of likes. And then quite famously later on, Kortright has continued to make short videos through her career, which are easily viewable on YouTube, but also which are priced using, she developed a pricing algorithm that allowed her to set the prices of the gallery editions for her work according to how many views they got online, right? So Kortright, I think, is not only drawing on the already quite readily available affinity between pricing and viewing, liking, sharing online, right? There's an already ready affinity there. But she's also, I think, instantiating something like an image of the volatility of online reputation. In other words, she's inventing ways to intervene in YouTube as a platform that allows one a certain a window of reputational value potential. And she's finding ways to intervene in that to show us a model of how reputation might be important, not because of the exact numbers, but because it might be volatile. And she's thinking about ways to capitalize on, but also to draw attention to that volatility itself as a form of value. This is something that Femke Herhaven has also thought about, I think, in really interesting ways in her work. And she's tried to produce meta images of speculation that I think act at an interesting sort of oblique angle to the ways in which contemporary online photography already produces meta images of speculation, of speculative value. And so in Volatility Storms, her online contribution to the Serpentine Gallery's Extinction Marathon, Herhaven produces a text and series of images that imagine how financial products understand climate change and potential global environmental catastrophe as sites for speculation, as sites for investor profiteering. And she designs not only images, but also diagrams of ways in which investors might actually be able to produce value, either by speculating on the extinction of species, for example, or indeed by being called on by governments to invest in preserving species. So on the right, you see her Volatility Storms investment portfolio diagram, which envisions a kind of sort of something like a kind of social impact bond kind of model, but that's based on preserving endangered species. So the idea is that governments do not have the money, or at least they're not willing to spend the money on preserving species. Therefore, investors will be called to sort of infuse infuse capital into this endeavor. And then if they are successful in preserving species, governments will pay them a dividend, a return. If they are unsuccessful, then they lose their investment to the government, right? And so I think that these ideas about kind of really actively imagining volatility as a way of understanding the role of images, but also the role of financial capitalism itself, is really sort of key to how these artworks work. But it also might give us ideas about what else might be done to intervene in the circulations of the contemporary image. And so, while it might be tempting to think about strategies of divestment in the face of the investment image of contemporary art. In other words, kind of disinvesting, right? Disengaging with imagery, taking oneself out of the picture. It might be that this is not the most effective way to go forward. And in fact, following FAIR, we might be better off starting with thinking about different ways to invest differently, to produce new alignments, new diagrams through which value produces affinities. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
I'm very mindful that there might be many questions. Does anyone want to kick off?
Hi, thanks very much. Those were so interesting, those presentations. Now, I'm I come from an NPO, so thanks, Ben, for that critique. I come from Red Eye. Now, we're a community benefit society which sits within the cooperative landscape rather than the capitalist one. So everything we do is about benefiting the community. So I'm just here to say there are alternative possibilities for MPOs, and it's an interesting line we tread, and making the case for doing that. But yeah, I take everything you said. And just if I may, to quickly talk about what Martin mentioned about blockchain. Latest news from Kodak One is I think they're not answering the phone or paying their bills. So people are claiming it was a scam, which looks correct. But that doesn't mean that distributed technologies aren't going to be important. I think they are going to be important for photography and photographers, and we're looking at that now. And I think things like metadata are critical. I know it got some criticism from the speaker, which it should do, but I think metadata is going to be even more important. So, I mean, I'm throwing those thoughts and ideas in. There's a lot more we could say about all of that, but thanks again.
If I could just respond to it, I absolutely agree with you. I think my criticism is mostly aimed at the kind of corporatization and the kind of black boxing of the potentials and really good potentials that blockchain applications might have. And yeah, as far as I know, Kodak Coin isn't going to happen. Yeah.
Hi there, yeah, thanks for brilliant talks. I'm interested in the complicity of photography and other images to cultivate neoliberal subjectivities, and in particular the sort of fetishization of individuality, and the way individuality has the authority within an image to align itself to a kind of, I don't know, Jurchak's idea of this sort of invisibility of neoliberalism, that it's so deeply intertwined into our subjectivity, our whole life, that it's become invisible, and now it's actually imbricated within the image to such an extent. I wonder if it's possible to somehow disentangle this. What sort of image would do that? If it was like, say, your idea of, or the idea explained earlier about the enemy image, what could one conceive of?
I mean, I could try to comment on this one. I think this is a really interesting question. Most of what I'm looking at the moment is about online reputation That's sort of the main project that I'm looking at the moment. And of course, I think it's very, very tempting to denigrate narcissism online, but it's also, there's a long history of denigrating narcissism that has been quite closely aligned with sexism, for example. And so I definitely do not want to produce some kind of a moralistic discourse that would sort of dismiss images as narcissistic. So I'm maybe, that said, I think I'm also, the more I work on online reputation, the more I'm thinking about young people and their experience of really growing up online and being so thoroughly subjectivated, by social media. And I think in many cases quite devastating effects that has on cognitive development. Michel Fer writes about how, as he puts it, profit is to pleasure for the liberal subject what credit is to self-esteem for the neoliberal subject. I think we're living in an age of self-esteem in some way, in which, as Fer puts it, the much less celebrated psychoanalytic discourses that were sort of based on self-esteem have actually become normative. And I think the more I think about online reputation, the more I think that this is enormously problematic for people who are growing up with this shit, which, I'm too old to have grown up with it. So I have a more privileged distance to social media in some way. I'm thinking about this a lot. And I think the challenge is to construct a kind of resistance that is quite complex and that does not dismiss the image. I've also been thinking about Marie-Josée Mozin's wonderful book, Image Icon Economy, which talks about debates around, this is a book from 2005 on the Byzantine origins of the contemporary imaginary. It's incredibly complicated, but it's kind of, it's about defenses and arguments for iconoclasm in the Byzantine Empire. As kind of the basis for our contemporary understanding of images, as in whomsoever rejects the image rejects the entire economy. So I'm kind of thinking about how to form resistance and resilience to this, incredibly harsh world of reputational images, without presuming that one can easily reject the entire economy, right? As a young person, as someone who wants to participate in whatever is left of like a polis, or you know what I mean. So this is kind of, I don't think I've answered your question, but maybe I've just sort of agreed with you and fleshed out some of the problematics.
I think one way of thinking about the extent to which it's implicated in neoliberalism, I think the idea of individualism is a really important one in understanding this relationship, is the extent to which the individual or the different is the kind of condition towards which we think valuable photography should aspire, right? And that's certainly true within the art world, and that plays out within the kind of artists that we celebrate. It also plays out in terms of the way artists engage with the vernacular or the mass, where you think of someone like Penelope Umbricote, there's a slightly, or Joachim Schmidt, the kind of slightly sneering class politics and putting together all these similar images, which sophisticated people like us can kind of secure some kind of fragile sense of difference. I think it's also true, I mean, Bella Pollin's work about, she's kind of argued against this as an approach to vernacular, that this shouldn't be understood as sameness, and she's spoken about it in terms of sunset photography, and she said, well, if you talk to all of the people who make sunset photographs, what you learn is that while they look similar, their intended meaning is very different. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a welcome contribution to unsettling that kind of art world denigration of kind of online sameness, but at the same time, I think it risks reproducing individualism and difference as the condition to which photography should aspire. So you can kind of twist it and say, well, why does it matter if we're the same? That's Jodie Dean's argument, right? Is actually, surely that's the basis for a kind of socialist subjectivity, would be a recognition of our similarity, rather than continually aspiring to be different and individual.
Last question? Can you just wait for the microphone because we're recording?
I just wanted to ask you in regards what you were saying about rejecting the image as a way of resistance of an economical system. How would you imagine that possibility within photography itself? I mean, we're photographers and we produce, meaning we produce images. I mean, I think taking it, into the sphere of, this aspect of the production system, photographers are creators and they're part of this, economic system as well. So how would you imagine to break that system as a producer of photography?
Sorry, who was that a question for? Was that? Who was that a question for? Was that for a particular, for anyone? Okay. I mean, personally, I have the perhaps slightly less ambitious view that that day turning and slightly tweaking what's already there might have more potential to be effective. In the world that I work in, I don't think of images or online photographs as separable from other cultural codes and categories of which they are also a part. So, for example, my way of thinking of photography, as you may have noticed, is absolutely intertwined with discourses on reputation. And what it means to have a reputation. Of course, this is a narrative problem as much as it is a problem of images and their circulation, and as much as any of those can in turn be questions of quantification through things like credit scoring, for example. So when I think about alternative or sort of maybe, even in a small way, kind of emancipatory uses of image circulation. I think about Me Too and Harvey Weinstein, for example, that there's like there's a moment in which the story of his, endless ridiculousness has been, it kind of gains enough momentum in the media where suddenly people go from feeling that like they can't talk about it if they want their, news stories to sell, to thinking they have to talk about it if they want their images to circulate. And so there's this kind of, there's this sort of flip that happens in the kind of atmosphere, the sort of volatile atmosphere of this news story that involves using imagery as a form of attacking the reputation of a very powerful white dude in a way that's, probably quite a good idea. It's a good use of images, but it also it's not as simple as saying that the images do that, right? They are part of a kind of maybe we could call it like something like a volatility storm of public knowledge of some kind, sort of circulated images of public predisposition within which one can intervene to some extent. So what I'm suggesting is kind of a much more limited understanding of agency than perhaps might be possible for another thinker who's more radical on this point, but also that's attempting to be kind of pragmatic about the small interventions that might be possible, now.
And there's a really complicated question about how much we kind of value, how much force we attribute to the individual agency of photographers, right, when they're operating within incredibly complex structures where the visibility of their work is going to be determined by all sorts of things that have, are linked to, right, to what's depicted in their photographs and how it's depicted, but also kind of operate apart from that. Having found out about Future being the popular stock image search term, Getty also are now deliberately putting, if you search CEO, they put in more pictures of women, right? So they are now building in an overt feminist politics into the provision of stock imagery. So then I Googled capitalism. I Getty search capitalism. And the incredibly interesting thing, they're really aggressive, horrible images. So speaking of that tipping point, at what point did that tip? Was there a kind of point when capitalism was kind of was being depicted within capital as something that served us in some positive way. But it's really, I mean, you Google post-capitalism, you just get 3 pictures of Paul Mason. So there's a space, right, in which photographers can intervene. What does post-capitalism look like in photographs?
Hello. I'm just wondering what you might say to a working photographer who could point out that one of those museum photos that had the watermark on them was theirs. So if someone in the room said that was mine, what would you say to them right now?
I was very open to the possibility, right? Because that was about, I was absolutely interested in the complicated social relations that play out through those images and the different forms of labour that are involved, and what that watermark means for an understanding of authorship, what it means for me to kind of appropriate that in that term, which is a bit of a politician's answer, right? But there was meant to be something, semi-self-reflexive in all of this. So I think it would be wonderful, and I would say to the photographer, what do you think? And I think that would be a really interesting thing to know about.
I think they'd say, where's my 50p?
But then I would say I didn't use your image because it's got the watermark on, so it's not yours anymore. That's a different image. It's not yours in any way. That's an image from my stock that I can take freely, totally legally.
We have time for one more question that was over here.
I'm sort of wondering where the image is, because it's not in the photograph anymore, is it? It seems that the image has kind of migrated somewhere else. And I'm wondering, in a sense, that can the poor photographer, rather than the poor image, follow that? And how does the poor photographer follow that? In terms of how we then start to think about photography, and how we start to think about the poor photographer and how she conceives of herself. Because it seems to me that what's been proposed here is quite radical. And it's great, it's brilliant. But it raises all sorts of questions.
I suppose, in my own way of thinking, at least, I think about the photographic image as partaking of the image more than being the image, perhaps. But I'm also very, very interested in images, like the range of ways in which things like reputation or character become images, not at all through photography necessarily, but through like quantified, button pressing, through fintech assigned credit scores that are meant to represent the quote unquote true self, with the acute artistry of what Zest Finance CEO Douglas Merrill likes to call a data artist, not a data scientist. In other words, he makes a claim that Zest Finance is so good at updating like the FICO credit score as a logic that they can really read the intricacies of data to really form a good picture, a kind of true picture. So, yeah, for me, photography partakes of the image, but it is not the image, and that's not the only kind of image that I'm interested in. And fundamentally, I always think about narrative as a necessary supplement to the sort of the space of the digital photograph, as something that can maybe think about how imagery always exceeds the frame by both being and pointing to circulation itself. What about you?
I think that the question of the poor photographer is a really, really good one, and one that I want to give a lot more thought to. One thing I would say is it's almost inherent in the Kodak 1 model, and to a certain extent in the Getty stock imagery model, is a kind of willful and knowing effort to deprofessionalise photography. I mean, it's an interesting question about who at what point one can identify as a photographer, and if it's, how many images does one have to sell before one becomes a photographer? And this is absolutely caught up in larger discussions around the kind of Uberization of everything, right? Where everyone's now a taxi driver and in any number, and maybe does a bit of data entry as well on Mechanical Turk, and you kind of actually begin to see the ways in which photography is implicated in that, and that must feel really shit for a professional photographer, but I think it's absolutely in keeping with what's happening across various fields of work more broadly. What we do about that, I mean, well, there's, I don't know.
Yes, very quickly. No, I'm just keep thinking about what you just said, and I think it's very important to make a difference in this kind of, theoretical approaches of, what is photography. That photographers who are actually educated wouldn't be the word, but I just got, the idea that as photographers we create, a discourse, and we decide where to put that idea, how to distribute that idea, in which platforms to be perceived. And another different things, which is completely opposite, I would say, is the online existence of these kind of images, which are not conscious discourses. They're not crafted. These are discourses which are empty images, which are taken by something wider, which is, where you're mentioning these investors, these people, corporate, ideas, who are, the reception of those images. So I think that's like a very big difference, and I just want to know what you think about that line, to distinct that, consciously.
I mean, one thing that I kind of immediately think about when you say that is Krakauer's essay, The Mass Ornament, in which he sort of argues that the surface level expressions of a society are much more important to think about than its quote unquote high expressions, right? Whatever we might mean by that. But that somehow on the surface of, in that essay he's talking about the Tiller girls dancing and things like that, but that there's something about the kind of what you referred to as the unconscious expressions, maybe, that is somehow speaks more directly to the condition of a time. So that, I'll just say that.
Well, thank you everyone for a wonderful panel, and we will be convening back at 2:05. So enjoy your lunch break, wander into Soho, do some shopping. Black Friday. Join the Extinction Marathon down the road, and then will we be back to speak more about the like economy and social media, I think. So, see you then.